Here we go. Well, welcome to the RJI, the Reynolds Journalism Institute. And today is Thursday, April 23rd. And we are going to launch into a discussion of energy and journalism and the issues that raises. And I'm Bill Allen. I teach science journalism here at the University of Missouri, and I'll be the moderator. I'm pleased to be the moderator today. And after a few opening comments here to sort of set the stage, I'm going to introduce our panelists and then turn it over to our keynote speaker, who will speak for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll have a dialogue with our panel members here. So let me begin by setting the stage and tell you that the American energy story is full of complex issues and changes. It's a story that began in colonial days when fuel wood was the major energy source for America. Coal took over as the main energy source in the 1880s and then was surpassed by petroleum and natural gas in the 1950s. Nuclear electric power came on in the 1950s as well. Other forms like biofuels are sometimes dubbed as alternative energy sources, as if their story were brand new. But did you know some of these have actually been around for a long time? For example, did you know that ethanol was all the rage in the very early 1900s? It was backed by Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell. Ethanol rose again as a popular idea in the 1930s and then again in the 1970s, only to be outmaneuvered in the political, economic, and media arenas by petroleum advocates. Well, so the point is that the story of energy is neither new nor simple. There are stories of politics, business, government, science, environment, and people on this beat. So, how are journalists today doing in reporting the energy story? What are their challenges in coverage? What are they doing right? What do they feel they can do better? And what can young journalists learn from all this? Those are some of our goals in this time we have this morning. So, I'm going to introduce the panel of experts at this time. First, to my left, your right, is Sharon Epperson, who is the senior energy correspondent and personal finance correspondent at CNBC. She's an award-winning journalist and author, and her expertise, among other fields, lies in energy prices and personal financial security. She covers a wide range of issues at CNBC, and her Money Smart column in USA Today Weekend reaches 49 million readers in over 600 newspapers. She has written for a wide range of publications: Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Time Magazine, Self, Essence, Ebony. And she has several books, including The Big Payoff, 8 Steps Couples Can Take to Make the Most of Their Money and Live Richly Ever After. So we hope for more of those, and I could go on and on about awards, honors. She's a graduate of Harvard and Columbia, and currently is an adjunct professor at Columbia's School of International Public Affairs. So I will welcome Sharon.
Thank you.
And before turning it over to her, I would like to introduce Ellen Sherbert, the next panelist over, who has been publisher of the St. Louis Business Journal since 1990. She joined the local business newspaper in St. Louis in 1980 and has served as a reporter, managing editor, and editor. Under her leadership, the Business Journal has received several awards, including the best weekly newspaper in the state of Missouri, or Missouri, and she is noted for her community involvement in St. Louis. She was elected to the Academy of Leaders of the YWCA of Greater St. Louis, among many, many other leadership roles and honors. Before joining the Business Journal, she worked as a reporter for KMOX in CBS Radio in St. Louis, and also for the St. Louis Globe Democrat. She has degrees from Vassar College and Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in New York City, and she has received an honorary doctorate from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So, welcome, Ellen. Last but not least, the next to the left, my left, your right, is Dr. Robert K. Dixon, who is currently leader of the Climate Change and Chemicals team at the Global Environment Facility in Washington, D.C. That's a World Bank institution. The GEF, as it's known, is a global partnership among 178 countries and international institutions and non-governmental organizations and the private sector to address global environmental issues while supporting national sustainable development initiatives. He's got a wealth of experience in Washington and around the world. He's worked in the White House with the National Security Council, where he was part of a task force on energy security and climate change. He has served as Associate Director for International Affairs for the Council on Environmental Quality, was a contributor to the 2007 Energy Security Act, and has worked at several positions in the Department of Defense, eventually becoming Deputy Assistant Director. Many other distinguished parts of his career that I could go into, but to highlight, we have given, I think, probably, I'd say 10% of his background and experience. Dr. Dixon did earn his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate here at the University of Missouri, and he has taught or lectured at many universities around the world. Welcome, Bob.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Good. So, that said, you know who we are and what our mission is. I'm going to turn the table over to Sharon Epperson, and welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I must say it is really an honor to be at the University of Missouri. I'm so impressed by this school and the facilities and the fact that so many people are going to be able to hear what we're talking about today virtually. So welcome to everyone who is watching and listening. When trying to prepare for today and thinking about reporting about energy, I wanted to start by giving myself a little bit of a test. At the end of last year, I did a piece on 9 things to watch in 2009 in the energy complex, in the energy market, and in the energy industry. And I wanted to go back and see if some of the predictions that I made in the first 3 or 4 months of the year, how they held up. And one of the top ones was, of course, it always comes down to where I am every day, which is on the floor of the New York Mercantile Exchange, looking at the price of oil. Where is the price of oil? Where is it going to be, and will we get back to that $100? Well, it just turns out that today, as we're doing this conference, the New York Times on its business page has a piece looking just at that same question, because it seems to be the eternal question. Where are prices today? Where are they headed? And why are they where they are? And the answer to the $100, will we get back to that $100 level? I think I got that right, because at the end of 2009, I said, I don't think so. I don't think we're going to get back there in 2009. And lo and behold, the unfortunate situation of the worldwide recession, the fact that demand is lagging so severely, particularly in this country. We're looking at demand for oil at an 11-year low. We're looking at supplies at a 20-year high. You would just expect that we were not going to see $150 oil like we nearly saw last summer. So that one maybe I think I got right there. The other big story to always follow, of course, in energy, and particularly for me covering oil, is OPEC. And how much power does OPEC have these days? The New York Times in its story today suggests that since OPEC has been cutting oil production since last fall, that has had an impact on keeping at least oil prices stable here around $50 a barrel, between $40 and $50 a barrel. But I think that there's a lot of controversy and questioning over whether or not OPEC is as strong as they once were among OPEC members and among other countries. The fact that they have cut back production so severely But you cannot combat a recession like this. You cannot cut enough, perhaps, to keep your budgets balanced in your own country and still be able to make money in your own country and still cut that back production enough to boost prices. It'll be interesting to see when they meet next month, if they decide to cut again, what we see. But I think that there is a lot of question and concern that OPEC may not be as strong as it once was, and a lot of interest in other countries, and particularly from Russia, in perhaps making it certain that they may not be as strong as they once were. So that's an interesting story to continue to watch. And the third thing that, as Bill introduced, I cover personal finance and energy. But I see, even though they are very different beats, them very much related. Because what is the thing that, as a homeowner, as a parent, as a consumer, that really impacts my financial life sometimes more than I'd like it to, and that is living in the Northeast in the middle of the winter, energy costs, or the heat of the summer, or trying to drive 25 miles a day from suburban New York to suburban New Jersey. It's energy costs. So I think a lot of the other story that I said we were going to be watching this year is whether or not we'd see gas prices stay around $2 a gallon, or we get back to $4 like we had in the summer of '08. And I think we're pretty much going to be where we are right now. And that, even though in light of the fact that there's so little demand, so much oil, you'd expect, why can't we pay $1 a gallon? We should be paying less on average. We're doing pretty well. We're saving probably $90, $100 this year from what we had last year, what we were paying just for gasoline alone, and that doesn't include the energy that we're using for our homes. And I guess the story that is changing by the minute, by the day, and constantly evolving and keeping energy reporters on their toes, Bob, is the Obama administration and the push toward cleaner energy. And how do we cover a story that is evolving, that has so much of an impact on the entire world and on American consumers and investors, but that right now, with energy prices that we have and the cost of energy we have right now so low, there's not that same, I'm so scared, I need to focus on this. So how do we as the media focus on something that really, isn't going to affect your pocketbook necessarily tomorrow? And unfortunately, we're often so short-sighted and into, immediate gratification or immediate pain type stories that we cover. But how do we get those stories out there so people are educated about the importance of knowing what all of the alternatives are and what the possibilities are and how long it will take us to get there and what we need to know to get there. So that is probably the biggest challenge, I think, for energy reporters for this year. The reason why I got into covering energy and why I think it's so important for students to include this if you're interested in business news, if you're interested in any type of journalism, because it's going to affect every aspect of your life, is because, frankly, it is the way that we cover it at CNBC, it's an integral market to cover. And so we see it as just as important as covering stocks, covering the fixed income market, and covering the commodity market. And we have learned in the last year, if we didn't already know it, and many of us did, but they are so intertwined and so interconnected that what is happening on the stock market is influencing what is happening in the commodities and the oil market, and vice versa at times. Currencies, all of that is interrelated. And so it gives me an opportunity to constantly come up with reasons, explanations, analysis of what is happening to the markets globally. My background is as a sociology and government major as an undergrad, because I always thought that I needed to know about something to write about something. And Harvard doesn't have a journalism program, so I didn't really have a choice. And then I decided to get my master's in international affairs, because focusing so much on the American perspective of government and sociology, I decided I needed to get a broader point of view. And this beat allows me to use that skill, to be able to, on a daily basis, talk about whether it's Saudi Arabia or Nigeria or Eastern Europe or Russia, or at least I'm not going to those places every day, I have a 4-year-old, a 7-year-old. I can't get on the plane necessarily every second and go to these places, but I can talk to people, and I can talk to the analysts, and I can, visit occasionally and be able to see what's going on in that way. So that kind of really has allowed me to focus on international relations in a very specific manner. I also took this beat at a time, I think, that was just, it was so fortunate because it was the most interesting time to start covering oil. I started covering energy in September of 2005. I was covering this beat during, some of the, of course, weather-related events, the hurricanes and all of that. I also was able to cover what we saw in the last 18 months, the rise of oil to $147 a barrel, and now the fall to December to $30, and all of the different, whether it was geopolitical or supply and demand, or just investors in the marketplace that had never been in there before, helping to facilitate and fuel what was happening with prices. So there was always something to talk about, and I still feel that it's one of the hottest beats to be in because there's so much going on now in terms of alternative energy and clean energy, and ethanol was all the rage, corn-based ethanol. No one's talking about that anymore. Now, what's it going to be next? There was a big story in the LA Times yesterday talking about someone who had spent $100 million building a plant to burn garbage to create fuel. I mean, we're trying to think of something, some alternative, because we know that that's the way it has to go. And so there's so many fascinating stories to tell about how to do that. So that's why I think it's, so important to cover this beat. And the last thing I'll say is I think it's also very important, I'm going to go back to, putting on my mom hat, that, the next generation, they need to know about energy, both the commodity and what we're, focused on right now, but also what is coming up next. And this past weekend for Earth Day, I took my son to one of our county parks and introduced him to a man who has a company that has a fleet of buses that run on vegetable oil. And he was just fascinated by how could this happen, and can this, and then he wanted to know, well, why don't we have a car like that? And, it's a valid, why don't we have a car like that, There is an interest that maybe those of us who say, okay, it's been like this all this time, we're not going to change it, among people who understand that it's going to have to change. And so we're broadening their horizons as we tell these stories. So I look forward to our discussion more about covering energy, and I thank you very much for having me.
Great, Sharon. Thank you. I think we'll hold our applause for the very end, since we're running short on time. But at this point, let me suggest that we give Sharon's magnificent voice, and but not her insightful mind, a rest, and switch over to the other members of our panel. We'll begin our panel discussion, and as the moderator, the prerogative is to ask some questions and get everybody warmed up, and then we'll invite questions from the audience, wherever you may be, electronically or local. Okay, so I think the question I'd like to start with, and if we could direct this toward Ellen and Bob, would be what do you see right now that the news media, the journalists are doing right in covering this beat, and what, let's just say, what kinds of improvements might be made, and if you have specific stories or personal stories about this, personal interactions, love to hear it.
Please go ahead.
From the point of view of the local journalist, I think what we do right is that we cover it at all, and I'm not sure that we ever did before. And I think that the spike in gas prices was the impetus, at least for those of us in business journalism. I think we reacted, and traditionally journalists react, and that's what we do wrong. Energy is a very complicated issue, and we are by nature transactional in our reporting. So, for example, we're more likely to cover the announcement that the governor of Missouri just made that he was going to reduce energy consumption on a statewide level by 20% over the next decade. We'll cover that announcement. And I guess the question is, will we follow through to see if he follows through? And where would we even start? I have to say, do we have any idea of how much energy the government consumes? How would we measure it? How will he measure it? Will we come back and keep his administration and future administrations honest on that? I don't know.
Okay. Thank you. Pleasure to be here today at the School of Journalism. Sharon and Ellen, Bill, thank you very much for the invitation. Working at the World Bank, I look at the world a little different than Missourians or even from Washington. It is true, I've served 3 presidents in the White House, but I'm going to speak to you about maybe some global megatrends, the 3 that I see that are most prominent. Obviously, Sharon highlighted some of them. The economy, the global economic crisis is unprecedented in my lifetime. And indeed, there's a connectivity between the global challenges that we face in finance and economy and the energy sector. In fact, there are some clever economists that can actually link the very high energy prices that Sharon spoke to a little earlier to was the part of the tipping point that moved us into the global economic crisis. So indeed, the economy is something that's on the minds of people around the world. It is true that I work in 178 countries, and trust me, every capital that I'm in, every private sector meeting that I go to, energy security and the economy are on the minds of people around the world. So it's not just a trend here in Missouri, it's not a trend just in the U.S., but this is something that transcends the globe, and it brings us all together. And I'd like to see journalists help tell that story. You all do a great job. I worked in the energy sector 25 years, but indeed, I think the interesting story is the connectivity of economic growth and the next trend, of course, energy security. It is true that energy prices are cheap today, relatively inexpensive on a historic basis. But as Americans or as citizens of the world, we all have to ask ourselves the question, are we on a sustainable energy pathway for the future? And admittedly, today energy prices are low. That's good for the consumers. But it's my prediction, my crystal ball's not perfect, maybe not as good as Sharon's, but indeed I predict that energy prices will climb as we grow out of the current economic crisis. And it may not be all that long before we see $150 a barrel oil, we'll see. But energy security is on the minds of leaders around the world and the citizens of the world. Like Sharon, I have kids aged 6 and 4. And when I think about their energy future and their energy security, I take the long view. We often are asked to look at 30 years or 50 years. And so I hope that journalists will help us think about the long view. And then finally, a driver that maybe is not on the minds of everyone today, but perhaps it should be, these are the environmental paradigms and such. I've been a negotiator on the climate change treaties for, I'm embarrassed to say, 20 years now. We've been working on this since 1989, trying to address growing greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, that's related to our use of fossil fuels and such, and the world is a-changing quickly. It used to be the U.S. was the #1 greenhouse gas producer. Now it's China, and soon Indonesia will move ahead of us. So indeed, the environmental drivers, the paradigms that I think are reshaping the energy sector is an exciting story for journalists to address in the future. So think about energy security, environmental protection, and economic prosperity, and how do we link those stories, because indeed it affects our lives today as well as the lives of our children.
Great, thank you. Perhaps Sharon has a few more thoughts on that particular question, although you did address some of the strengths and weaknesses of journalism today on the energy beat.
It's hard to tell stories about what is going to happen 20, 30 years from now. It's very hard to tell it on television,
Yes.
because there are no pictures to show what it's going to look like then. But it's critically important. So the way that we tell the story, and I definitely agree with you that prices are low now, but they're not going to stay that way. And the way that we can show that is to show the lack of production and the lack of investment in production and exploration that many of the oil companies, the energy companies, are saying that they're doing. And again, it's important to have people tell this story, but it is also hard to show that rigs are shut down. What do you show? It's just like it's shut down.
Right.
But what does that mean long term? And that does mean that our children are going to face, higher prices, and it may not even be, it could be 2 years from now. It happened so quickly that prices went from $50 a barrel when I started covering on the floor of the NYMEX to $150. That who's to say that that couldn't happen again? And so we do need to be prepared, but the problem is how do we tell that story in a compelling way when there's no way to really show what the potential impact is? It's only projections of what could happen. And we know intellectually what that is, but visually for television and even in trying to quantify it, in an article, it's difficult to do that.
It is a challenge. I encourage us to look at our history. It's the old saying, if we don't examine our history, we're doomed to repeat it. But I reflect on my life growing up here in Missouri. 1974, I graduated from high school, and remember what happened in 1974? The oil shocks, right?
Yes.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that's
And
true.
President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, it was a terrible problem. I remember as a youngster, newly minted Missouri driver's license, and waiting in line to buy petroleum products here in Missouri. And certainly that was a bit of a blip on the radar screen, and we got past that. But frankly, our dependence on imported oil here in America is much greater. It was about 30-40% at that time. Today, it's close to 70% of our imports come from outside our borders. So we can look at our history and perhaps project a future. When I graduated from the University of Missouri in 1982, interest rates were very, very high. On my first loan for my house, very happy to get it. I paid 13% for a loan, and we think, gosh, we've seen this housing crisis before, haven't we? And so there are opportunities to look at our history and perhaps project what the future will look like. It's a tough job, but I invite any journalists who'd like to join me on a World Bank mission to visit parts of the world where they don't have energy services. About a third of the planet today, a third of the people on the planet, almost 2 billion people, don't have any energy services whatsoever. We take energy for granted in the wealthy countries here in the U.S., and we have very severe challenges in the U.S. in the energy sector. But please be mindful as you go to bed tonight that about a third of the planet has no heat, has no light, no facility for cooling their food or protecting their medicines from spoiling. So that puts it in a larger perspective. I'm not predicting that we're going to see anything like that in the U.S., of course, or the other OECD countries, but in fact, there are some interesting and compelling stories to tell, and I'm mindful that this is an increasingly small planet. We all move around the wonders of the information highway and the transportation systems, and I invite you on these missions to, in fact, join us and help us tell the story of alleviating poverty, bringing energy services and prosperity to parts of the world where it's never been seen before.
Well, that opens a big wide door. I wonder, Sharon or Ellen, if that's the kind of invitation for a story that your people might be inclined to want to pick up on.
I would assume, Bob, that there are places in Missouri that you could also take us to.
You're right. We could look in the counties here in Missouri. We both were just with Governor Nixon a few minutes ago, and of course he outlined for us a very graphic sketch of the economy here in Missouri and some of the energy challenges that are being faced. And yes, it's here at home, it's around the world, and the challenges are the same, perhaps to a different scale.
I think our challenge is that it's hard to find the sort of comfortable place between informing people and fear-mongering.
Very important. Very important.
It's very true. I mean, one of the things that has been in the New York press recently is talking about electricity and the impact of rising property taxes and the impact that that has had on our main utility in New York, on Con Edison, and having to raise the electricity rates at a time when people can barely afford to pay their rents, to pay their mortgages. You have to talk about how all of these things are connected, but the story just leaves you angry or, sometimes paralyzed by the fear of what's next. And you don't want that to happen. You want people to be inspired to do something about it, to work with you, Bob, or to help solve these problems. And it's difficult to sometimes tell the stories that you need to tell without getting people, worried or afraid. But then on the other hand, as you started by saying, that's how we got these stories in the papers and in the placements that we did on television in the first place, was by having people worried about, oh my gosh, I'm paying $4 a gallon for gasoline. Now we got to start talking about this stuff. Now I have to figure out what's going to happen next. So it's a fine line, but I think it is something that it's a necessary evil almost.
One of the challenges we face, and Bob, you must be able to sit at a table and bring everybody together, is that there's so much competition, I guess is the nicest word, within the energy community. Mm. And so that often, and Bill, you must have seen this a lot when you were covering energy for the Post-Dispatch. So the conversation about whether or not there should be a new nuclear plant in Missouri becomes a conversation about whether we really don't need to invest more in wind. And it's hard to understand my frustration.
I do, Ellen. I think it's a great point. And I'm frequently asked, who are going to be the winners and losers in this competitive energy market? And I'm sure, Sharon, you're asked the same question. I'm sure you are, Ellen, as you work with the business community. But my response is always the same. We need all of these technologies. We need all of these energy sources. The natural resource base, the demographic trends and such, they may differ from state to state or country to country, but in fact, I think there's room at the table for a competitive energy industry, bringing energy goods and services to a broad spectrum of consumers. And whether it's nuclear energy or wind energy, to me, it's a false choice. We need both. We need all. We need all these sources. We live in a planet that's hungry for energy, and in fact, that demand is going to grow. For years, the United States was the leader in energy consumption, but we're going to move to number 2 or number 3 on the list. Our Chinese friends are moving ahead of us. They're putting on electricity grid the size of the United Kingdom every year. And so this demand for energy is growing rapidly, and as these many billions of people who've lived in poverty for all of their lives are now achieving the quality of life that we aspire to, that we have here in the U.S., this energy appetite will only grow. So I think competition's good, and I hope we have a lot of competition, and because I think it brings out the best ideas, best technologies. But I think we're going to need them all. I hope we do. So
I agree with that, but in trying to, the concrete reality of trying to cover a story,
yes,
like the opening of the nuclear plant, and you call a nonprofit group that you think is going to give you some perspective on this, but actually their real focus is on wind. And so they're going to tell you something negative about this,
sure, even
though they're supposed to be on the same team. It makes it difficult to figure out how do you source this? These are all relatively new sources of energy, new sources in terms of information. And so it is a challenge for us as journalists to figure out, after we cover the announcement, who do we go to do the checks and balances? And how do we, if we are going to do that research and that reporting ourselves and not rely on the nonprofit, the think tank, which ones can we go to figure out where to get the proper information even? So it is increasingly complicated and challenging to do that, because you do have people who are saying we do need it all and then undercutting it. Even the major oil companies, when I'm talking to a CEO or an executive of a big oil company, they always say, we definitely have a plan for alternative energy. But then you say, okay, well, what do you think about electric cars? Well, no, well, first we have to have cars that have better fuel consumption, and then we have to move away from, biofuels, and then we have to go to hybrid cars, and so then they're basically telling you, well, in 20 years we'll look at that. So it's difficult to figure out. What would you suggest?
Well, there is a complicated story. I think we all admit that this morning. But I encourage. Spend a lot of time working with journalists. I encourage them to think, again, being perhaps repetitive, but to take the long view. Admittedly, today, you're focused on what happened today. You're going to report that tonight. But to the degree that we can begin to work with the consumers of all this information and help them think about the long term, because, in fact, decisions that they're making today influence them their entire lives. Here's an anecdote. If we build a new coal-fired power plant here in Missouri or a new nuclear plant, that plant will be with us for the next 100 years. And indeed, you have to take the long view when that plant is sited, when it's constructed, when it's operated, because the decisions that are taken today in today's marketplace are going to influence us for not only us, but our children and perhaps our grandchildren. I don't want to bury us in statistics here, but I'm mindful that over 90% of all the power plants that have ever been built in America are still operating. We don't tear them down. Right. And so decisions, investments that are made take us multiple decades. But it's a complicated story. The transport sector is one that we've got to work on. It's a compelling part of our energy picture. Indeed, it's the most complicated, but perhaps it's the most important, because we're all reliant on personal transportation systems. But yet we know that the fumes coming out of the tailpipes are polluting us. They're damaging our health, our public health, and our environment. We know that, in fact, we don't want to be dependent upon others for fossil energy sources. So we have to move away. We have no choice. As we heard Boone Pickens say here in Columbia, Missouri yesterday, you've got to move on. I'm an oil man, but you've got to move on. You've got oil men standing here and say, that was the past. Let's look to the future. So we've got to get the transport sector right. It's going to take a long time. It won't be easy. We are going to move through multiple generations. The transportation systems, we will move to hybrids. I'm hoping all the panel members drive hybrids today. And then we're going to have to move to electric vehicles and hydrogen-powered cars. And it's going to be complicated. But there's an energy revolution underway. Shanghai Automobile Show is this week. It's now become the largest automobile show in the world. And indeed, you look at the showroom and the cars that are on the floor for the largest automobile market in the world, China. You're looking at a different generation of cars, a different type of transport systems than we have here in America. So perhaps we need to look outside our borders for emerging trends in the transport sector. But Sharon, you're right. It's hard. I'd like to hear Ellen comment a little bit about this. Obviously, Kansas City and St. Louis are major assembly points for automobiles. At one time,
or at least have been.
Have been. I don't know where Missouri stands on the list today, but at one time, Missouri was number 2 after Michigan in assembling automobiles and trucks.
Well, now we're number 2 in layoffs after Michigan, which is a less dubious honor. And I think, to your point, that economics will drive attention to this maybe more than global warming. So that as the major domestic car manufacturers struggle economically, and as they go for more government help, I believe the Obama administration will enforce some changes in manufacturing, make the car industry more responsive to the environment, and that will drive the consumer. Unfortunately, I don't think the consumer is going to be in the lead in that, but I guess it gets there one way or the other.
It's going to come down to jobs.
I think it's going to be jobs and dollars. It's going to be like the gasoline, the lines around the gasoline pumps.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. You're going to have to be able to show people how much they're going to save, and that's the bottom line as to when they're going to start to pay more attention. But then also, because of the number of layoffs and because of the restructuring of the auto industry, you're going to have to be able to show them in jobs. You say that this is going to create more green jobs. What does that mean? What can I do? How do I reinvent myself? How do I get one of those the 2 million plus jobs you say are going to be created. And once that happens, again, that's how we get attention focus, because it still has to come down to how does it impact my life. And we can say it does because, look, 30 years from now, look at what's going to happen to the next generation intellectually. But I think the person who's going to go to our website, buy the paper, tune into our broadcast is going to want to know now, how does that get me a job or save me money in this economy?
Now, it's interesting. I have seen, we did a seminar on the greening of St. Louis, and one of the sponsors, indeed, were the Sheet Metal Workers Union.
Yes.
Because they do all that air conditioning and heating work, and they understand that if they don't retrain, and if they're not at the head of that line, they might lose the jobs they have now. So
Right.
I think the labor actually gets it. The rest of us, I'm not so sure.
Well, we live in interesting times. Indeed, these crises perhaps provide the motivation for addressing some of the opportunities, this nexus between new technologies and the green economy. And I'm encouraged. The leadership taken here in Jefferson City, Washington, and other places where the investments in the green economy are aimed at the bottom line, at producing jobs and raising incomes. And it is encouraging, and I think it's not just a passing trend. We're going to need to embrace a new infrastructure. I'm mindful that the energy infrastructure in the U.S. was built in and around the Second World War. It's now 60, 70 years old. We have over 1 million miles of transmission wires, electricity wires in the U.S. that are over 50 years old. Well, replacing that old technology and, in fact, building the new infrastructure, as the Obama administration has, and the Congress, support from Congress, has moved towards these public sector investments to put people to work and to build out a new energy infrastructure for the future.
Well, let me jump in here and say we have a very energized and wonderful conversation going here, and I hate to jump in, but we do need to allow folks to ask some questions and direct our discussion. And so at this point, we are going to offer the microphone to the audience, and if no questions come, I'll do my professor thing and just, we'll all sit here looking sorry, and somebody will.
Introduce yourself, Conrad.
Sorry. My name is Conrad Delouche. I'm a senior here at Mizzou, broadcast journalism student. Excuse me? Oh, I'm from Houston, Texas, and I apologize. I'm a little out of it. I just got back in town. So if you guys have any questions.
We hear about all of the incentives for us doing reporting about and changing policies on energy, but it seems to me there's an awful lot of disincentives, economic disincentives, the media with the various layoffs and not really trying to can't cover what we have been covering very well already. And it just seems to me that if in the 70s with lines around the block and stagflation of 18, 20% or whatever, if that couldn't get us to take the long view, what's going to get us to take the long view now?
Well, I mean, I think, again, I think it comes down to what is impacting your life right now, whether it's, here's where the jobs are, here's where the sheet metal workers or wherever the green jobs are, and here's how you save money. And other than that, it is going to be very difficult to get that on the radar, to get that as one of the top stories. And but if it's used with that angle, it will become the most viewed story on the website, or it will become, the front page story.
But I mean, most people, as you said in your opening remarks, are saving $90 or more a year on gasoline, not counting the energy costs for their home. And, we kind of have short attention spans these days. And that the sheet metal worker or the auto assembly worker, that doesn't affect most people. So I'm not sure how you reach most people with that message. I don't mean to be too cynical about it, but I wonder how you cut through that short-sightedness.
Well, T. Boone Pickens spent $58 million, and that seemed to work.
Well, did it? I mean, we're having a conversation, but is it going to change?
I think we are. I mean, I think look at the stimulus package. It primarily revolves around energy and infrastructure. So there is leadership, at least in Washington and in state capitals, to put public sector funds, I think you're seeing a response. President Forsey here at the University of Missouri System convening Missouri's first energy summit. I think that's newsworthy and noteworthy in the sense that at least we're talking. I can tell you, being a student here at the University of Missouri in 1982, when stagflation was occurring and such, we didn't have the dialogue. At least I didn't, and I was a pretty active graduate student here and hopefully pretty astute and followed what was happening on campus. And I didn't see this kind of leadership in Jefferson City or other places that we see today. I'd also add to the comments that Ellen and Sharon made that 1974, those oil shocks lasted about, what, a month or two or three? And I think the economic crisis that we're in today, I'll let Sharon have the final word on this, but I don't think we're going to solve this in a month or two. And I don't think we've seen an erosion in our 401ks, 40, 50%. I don't hear any economist saying we're going to bounce back by May. I don't hear anyone say that, oh my gosh, the energy security is going to go away. The energy security is just going to go away. It's not. We live in a very different world than we did 30 years ago. The emergence of the big Asian economies, they were a fraction of what our economy was 30, 40 years ago. Now we're not in this prominent position that we once were. We're not alone at the top of the economic pile. We are competing in ways that we've never competed before. All Americans should be mindful that when President Bush talks to President Hu in China, he's talking to his banker. The world has changed. And so I think there are compelling stories on economic prosperity and energy security, and perhaps we need to dig a little deeper. And again, I'm going to say it one more time, take the long view if we can hold the attention of our friends.
I think the other thing that's happening, and it may not be as interesting as a journalist to cover, because you're not necessarily telling a story with the human component and some numbers. But if you're focused on the announcement, or if you're focused on the speech of the day, Obama is brilliant on messaging. And every message includes the word energy.
Yes.
And so we're forced to cover energy because he talks about it all the time. And the same is true of the governor, in the announcement today. And that is how we keep it on the front page as well, because because he's doing it, and we're covering what he's saying. And that is, I think, really going to help both energy, healthcare. The Obama platform, he is on point to the message to the point where you could say it yourself because you've heard it so many times. But it forces it to be on the front page.
May I share an anecdote? Because I want to applaud the journalism community here. I've been in this business a long time. I travel around the world and I speak publicly 200, 250 times a year. And one of my habits, frankly, is to always pick up the local newspaper or some local publication and try to find the best energy story. I don't have to look much past the first page or the second page. Energy has been covered in a big way for a long time, and indeed we're facing unprecedented crises, but energy is almost always on the front page of the local newspaper, whether I'm in Bolivia or Bhutan or in China or here in the U.S. It's always near the top of the story, whether energy prices are high or low. There's environmental paradigms, there's security paradigms, and the energy services challenges that I talked about a few minutes ago, the billions around the planet that are unserved. So you all have done a great job of covering it, because I always like to take that local newspaper and hold it up in that opening introductory remark that I make to different crowds around the world that are interested in this issue. So the coverage is good. We just got to keep it up.
I'm Marty Stephenson, professor here. Let's focus on the journalists and what they need to know to cover this story. This is exceptionally complex, and with a lot of different points of view, from the consumer point of view to the business-to-business, geopolitical. Plus, it's a ever-expanding field, from people who build sidewalks that capture energy from footsteps to solar energy, wind, nuclear. It's a huge and complex debate. When it's that complex, it raises a lot of questions for journalists. Certainly, one is understanding the science, journalists can be easily led when it's a science question about solar energy or ethanol or soy fuels or other, because they just don't have that level of understanding. Second of all, economics, and especially complex world trade issues, baffle PhDs who don't forecast very well, much less journalists who have to be generalists. Second, and lastly, the geopolitical aspect. Understanding the complexities of what it means for the Russian economy, Chinese economy, Brazil, Venezuela, and those kind of players. So, focusing on training that journalists need to understand everything from ethanol properties in gasoline and whether ethanol can push a car or a diesel or a 18-wheeler to all the other aspects. What sort of education do journalists need, or training do they need? And this is a conversation about deficits in the journalism community, deficits that need to be overcome so they can ask those demanding questions.
I was going to say, I think it starts with Journalism 101 of finding your sources. You're not going to necessarily be an expert on all of those topics. They are extremely complex, whether it's the science, the economics, or the geopolitics, but you need to know who to ask, and you need to know, when you ask that person, what point of view they are going to present you with, so that you have kind of, if you know that they're going to have one point of view, you want to make sure you ask someone else that covers that realm. I think it's important to know who to go to. It's not necessarily important to know the answer before you even start the story, but you need to know who you're going to contact to get that, and that just comes from basically doing the stories, reporting, getting as many contacts and networking as much as you can.
I also think that the notion of the journalist as generalist is maybe a little outdated. And as we see journalism going away, as daily newspapers struggle, we see those who have a niche still surviving, if not thriving. The Business Journal being an example of that. And so I think that when you have somebody at CNBC who specializes in energy reporting, that tells you that you ought to be training people to be energy reporters, not general rewrite people, because we don't have rewrite anymore. I mean, there is no rewrite. There's just write. And sometimes not even that, or Twitter. I mean, there's, so the educational system has to, really jumpstart to keep up with the industry. And the industry has changed as dramatically in the last 6 months as the rest of the economy has.
I think specializing, and I did not think this necessarily when I got into journalism, but perhaps I did, because I didn't get a major in journalism, but I did focus on international relations, and at the time African studies and international communications were my focus in graduate school. But you need to know something well to write about it, to report about it. And whether that means taking a minor, having a minor here in a specific discipline, or doing your internship that's not a journalism internship, but is an internship at a think tank or at some type of nonprofit or some type of agency where you're learning on the ground what this, either if it's energy or if it's healthcare or some other discipline. But you definitely need to know something. I do agree with that. And I think it is interesting how many students are interested in business journalism because it's setting them apart.
May I add a perspective from a non-journalist, but who graduated from this university a few years ago. I wouldn't beat up too hard on the journalism community for not producing folks that focus on energy. I'm mindful that this is, frankly, been a long-term trend across many American universities. We're not producing graduates who address the field of energy. And I speak with some authority because I hire a lot of folks coming out of school in government and at the World Bank and other organizations that it's pretty hard to find a graduate that's got an energy degree in their title. And we talk about aspiring to the new nuclear energy economy and such, but in fact, I challenge any of you to go out and find a handful of newly minted nuclear engineers. We're just not producing them anymore. So I'm not sure that the journalism schools should beat themselves up too badly about this issue because, in fact, it's a broad trend. We've not invested in our young people in the energy field, and I think we're sorry to say that we're reaping some of the fruits of our labor.
Beyond that, and not necessarily specific to energy, I think that we also have to teach young journalists and old journalists alike to sit still and listen. I don't say this with any pride, but I was able to attend the entire summit, energy summit that was just held in Columbia. But I could do that because I'm the publisher of the newspaper, whereas the reporters at our newspaper are writing 2, 3, and 4 stories a day. So they didn't really have the opportunity to learn as I did. And I think that as our media world becomes ever so much faster, you know, we're all having ADD, even more than we did before. And we're not going to know enough to be able to synthesize it. So if I had one piece of advice to a young reporter, it would be slow down, learn something, and then you can speed up and tell it to other people.
Yeah. That's very good advice. One of the things that, and I've been telling my students at Columbia for years, is I think my training at Time Magazine before going into television was excellent because I was forced to have to, if I was covering a hearing, sit back and get the color, describe what the defendant, what the plaintiff, what was their. And I'm like, this is going to be 2 lines, and then the writer in New York is going to take it and they're going to embellish it with, but it trained me in observation, in research, in analysis, in a way that if I had just started off doing television, particularly doing the way I do it now, which is 10 live hits in a 6-hour period, I would never be able to focus the way that I can when I have the opportunity. But I don't have that much of an opportunity to do that.
May I speak to a role model? It's an honor to be with Ellen and Sharon and Bill today, but when I was with the Bush administration, the president's energy advisor, one of my favorite journalists, you're all my favorites, but was Tom Friedman. And to the degree that a role model for young journalists who were thinking about covering this issue, Tom dug deep. He followed us around. He followed me around the globe. He followed me to the climate change negotiations, followed me out to the field to look at a new energy investment and such. And of course, he's in a very unique position, in a unique career and such, perhaps. But it's certainly an interesting role model for young journalists to look at and thinking about covering the energy community, because not only does Tom do it in his column each day, and if you read his column every day, and I do, Tom, I read your column every day. Indeed, 3 or 4 hits a week, he's talking about energy in his books and his work in television. So it's one role model. We've got another great role models here in this panel today, but I have to say, at a national level, I really admire Tom's work and what he's been able to do by just sticking with the issue. I mean, it's not been popular to cover this issue, and he gets beat up from time to time. I've seen him get beat up for covering this issue, but he stays with it because he understands how important it is for America's future. So, one role model for the young journalists out there. Many good role models here in the room.
Good morning. My question is about balance and responsibility. You've all mentioned that there's many different sources and lots of different points of view. From the perspective of a reporter with a beat, how do you know when you have come to enough sources and which ones to use and which ones are just a vocal minority? From a general assignment reporter or someone who has more of a broad business perspective, how do you decide when you have asked enough people the question to provide that balance? And then from your perspective, the view of reading and following energy stories, what are good examples of that and bad examples of that?
So how do you decide whether or not you have enough sources? Intellectually or practically? Okay, so my day starts, the deadline basically, you know. If I have a report at 9 o'clock and something breaks and my next live shot is at 9:30, I call as many people as I can. If I don't already have some idea of what's going on, and I say who their names are and, you know, what they told me, and, you know, Google it. You know, if you want to find out what because I have 30 seconds, I have a minute to report it, and I have 20 minutes to prepare for it. So that deadline pressure forces me to only be able to call a few people. The preparation comes in the years of covering it, of knowing, having that person on speed dial, knowing who to call, knowing who I am, knowing who's going to get back to me right away. In terms of if I'm doing a longer story, I do ask around to find out what people think of that particular source. So if it's going to be a key, if it's going to be a key person in one of my long-form pieces, I'm going to probably interview either on camera or off camera a couple of people around them to make sure that they're the right person for that perspective. And if they're not, that interview might just get shelved. I mean, now it doesn't necessarily get shelved; it just goes on the web too. So we use everything. But there's all but that's how you do it, I think. But I think the practical way is that the reality is that you have a deadline, and you talk to as many people as you can before you have to meet that deadline. And hopefully you've done your homework enough to know who to call.
I think it's pretty much the same for us. I think what you want to look out for are media whores. Those people who love to be quoted and have really got the soundbite down and don't know any more than you do. And usually your other sources are more than too happy to point them out to you.
It's true.
Here's an anecdote. 1989, I was one of a handful of scientists who began working on the issue of global climate change. And I can tell you without compunction that, in fact, no journalist was interested in talking to me. It was an unknown issue. Nobody cared. And, in fact, it was a very kind of boring story. And there's just a bunch of scientists running these big, complicated models and working on greenhouse gases and a lot of things that nobody really paid much attention to. Let me go fast forward to 2007, when my colleagues and I in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. We were all co-recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. Gosh, we had a lot of coverage then, and a lot of people knocking on my door and still knocking on my door to cover these stories. But and it's interesting to see, how the science had changed, how the public interest had changed over 2 decades. But I'm going to get to your point about fair and balanced. And it was interesting. We worked pretty hard for 2 decades to try to get the science right and to try to provide unbiased and balanced scientific reporting of the facts for decision makers to make decisions. But I always found it interesting that we had 5,000 of the world's leading scientists standing together with one voice and saying climate change is an issue we need to pay attention to. I was always intrigued with the journalists that would chase around and find that one naysayer. They had to look pretty darn hard to find him or her, but they always found it, and they always ran it side by side. That, in fact, they got the same amount of airtime as those of us who'd been working in the trenches for multiple decades, investing public resources and trying to get the science right to make informed decisions. I'll let you decide, what lessons to learn from that story, but those are reflections from my life as a scientist and as a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and someone who works with your community each and every day and enjoy working with you. But I think there are some lessons and thoughts there for you to reflect on as you build your career in the future.
I just want to say quickly, I think that is a lesson for whatever you're covering in journalism.
That's right.
And I think we do spend a lot of time saying, he said, but she said, but if there were 20 she's and one he, you have to put it in perspective. And I think that is a challenge for all of us, no matter what we're covering, but particularly as we're covering this in energy. You want to try to present the other side or to ask that challenging question, but when it's just out there and it makes perfect sense, you have to really cover it that way.
Well, thank you. We're going to do something fairly unusual, which is to end our panel on time, which is painful because this has been such a fascinating, dynamic, and informative discussion. I want to thank our panelists, and in summary, we have learned that we're covering an energy revolution, and it's complicated, and we need to try to do better. And yet we're doing pretty well if you listen to Dr. Dixon.
You are. Keep it up.
All right, so that's we got some challenges, and we're still patting ourselves on the back a little bit. So I want to thank Sharon Epperson, Ellen Sherbert, and Dr. Robert Dixon for joining us today. It's been excellent, and please join me in thanking them, and thank you.